Hi, it's Dwyer, gamblersadvisory.com, dwyervip.com, and for those of you with Roku boxes, you can find us on a private channel on Roku called, one word, Dwyer Boxing. Remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. This weekend has an intriguing fight between George Groves and Glen Johnson. Now, let me just say, I believe that gamblers need to know when to say when. This is one of those occasions. My advice to you is to stay on the sidelines. Enjoy the fight as a fan. But as a gambler, I believe your money is better spent elsewhere. George Groves is a huge favorite. He's a 6-to-1 to 8-to-1 favorite depending on the sports book. Now, for those of you looking for odds being offered by the different sports books, just go to oddschecker.com. They have a category called Sports A-Z. Just click on that, go down to boxing. You'll be surprised how many sports books are offering different odds on this fight. Now, even though Groves is the younger man, and even though Groves is the better athlete, right? George Groves, in my opinion, is the kind of fighter who can break your heart. Let me just talk about his gifts. George Groves is a huge puncher. I mean, really outsized punching ability. Although he's fought a few times since the start of 2010, the only man during that period of time to make it to the 7th round against George Groves is James DeGale. Right? He's a big puncher. He has one punch knockout power. He also has hand speed to go with the punch. He also has a jab. In other words, this is a guy with a lot of tools. He has a jab to keep you at bay. He doesn't beat James DeGale without that jab. He also has foot speed, so he can actually operate behind a jab on the outside. He doesn't even have to flash his power unless he wants to. And of course, in this fight, he has youth. He's the younger man. One would assume, even though most of his fights end inside of 7 rounds, one would assume that stamina would be on his side, right? The ability to come back from a headbutt or any kind of physical injury would be on his side. Here's the problem. Although George Groves doesn't really have to flash his power, he could literally win this fight on his back foot, circling Glen Johnson. Right? Lucien Bute beat Glen Johnson by circling him for 12 rounds. George Groves has the talent to do it. The problem is George Groves has something else. He needs to fight. For whatever reason. Right? This would be like watching Ali jabbing a guy to death, and then just needing to step inside and duke it out, even when he has to fight one. Historically, a good example of the mentality I'm talking about, years ago, earlier generation, but believe it or not, tapes are up online, Billy Conn against the legendary Joe Louis. Billy Conn had the fight. Billy Conn just had to run away the last 2 rounds. He had the fight. He had beaten Joe Louis. And you know the rest. It just wasn't who Billy Conn was. He had to, for whatever reason, after embarrassing Joe Louis for more than 10 rounds, I mean, literally, huge lead. For whatever reason, Billy Conn felt that he had to close the show. And of course, the one thing you didn't do against Joe Louis was try to close the show. Right? Billy Conn got knocked out. As Louis said, Billy, I gave you the heavyweight title for several rounds, and you didn't know what to do with it. Well, that's the problem with George Groves. He's outside. He's winning the fight. He's shooting a jab. For some reason, he gets caught up. He knows he has the punching power. He feels he has to try to knock you out. And we all know that his opponent has one of the best chins in boxing history. Understand, Glen Johnson hasn't been stopped since the 1990s, right? When he lost to Bernard Hopkins, right? Glen Johnson has gone more than 10 years, more than a decade, without being stopped. And if you look at the list of fighters he has fought, and they include guys with huge punches, like Carl Froch, right? Roy Jones, guys who have resumes with a lot of knockouts. You're going to see that somehow, Tavares Cloud, somehow Glen Johnson, even at light heavy, seems to stay on his feet for all 12 rounds, right? Now this fight has disaster written all over it for Glen Johnson. He's in with a guy who hits much harder than the public realizes. Groves is blessed with a punch. Also, Johnson has had some lackluster performances of late where he was on the verge of getting knocked out. Didn't get stopped, but was on the verge of getting knocked out. There's a moment in the Tavares Cloud fight where Glen Johnson gets hit hard and has to hold on, right? Quite frankly, I thought he was fortunate in his last fight against Fonfara that fight didn't have a couple extra rounds, because Glen Johnson was running on E at the end of the fight. He could not match Fonfara's volume, and Fonfara was getting confident. Quite frankly, had Fonfara pushed the issue, he may have stopped Glen Johnson. The other problem, and this is straight out of my book from years ago, How to Bet on Boxing, is that when you see an older guy, especially a guy like Glen Johnson, a guy who's not just in his 30s, he's in his 40s, folks. When you see an older guy, and he's actually fighting at a weight class that's below where he usually has fought, and keep in mind, Glen Johnson was a light heavyweight. He lost weight to get to super middle simply because of the money and the Showtime tournament and the opportunity. So Glen Johnson then lost the weight, right, to get down to super middle. You and I know Glen Johnson's not really a super middleweight, right? He's been slumming in the division for a while now, and quite frankly, it shows, right? Johnson doesn't have the pop that he's had in the past, right? Johnson, as I've said, against Fonfara, was on E at the end of the fight. Johnson looked lethargic against Lucien Bute. Quite frankly, at super middle, Johnson's crowning glory was beating Alan Green. Alan Green hasn't been winning a lot of fights of late. Alan Green, the last I saw him, he was getting knocked out by Mikkel Kessler, right? Other than the Alan Green fight, Glen Johnson hasn't had a lot of success at super middle of late, right? He lost to Carl Froch, he lost to Lucien Bute, he lost to Fonfara. And so Glen Johnson right now is that older fighter who, quite frankly, is looking for one last hurrah. And make no bones about it, between these two, even though Johnson is really a light heavyweight, between these two, the guy with the bigger punch is George Groves. The guy with the faster hands is George Groves. The guy with the foot speed advantage is George Groves. The better athlete is George Groves. And of course, to top it off, the fight's being fought in George Groves' backyard. So George Groves has every advantage in the book. But I can't take him to win the fight, even though I think he wins the fight, right? I think, quite frankly, he has an outside shot at a stoppage, right? Because this fight's 12 rounds. It's not 10 rounds. And Johnson, quite frankly, is To say past his prime is being polite. He's several years past his prime, right? Several years. You know, that Roy Jones victory was several years ago. And even then, Glen Johnson was viewed as an older fighter, right? So I do believe that George Groves has an outside shot at a stoppage, something no one's done to Glen Johnson for more than 10 years. Here's the problem. I watched George Groves against Francisco Sierra, a guy who doesn't have fast hands, who, doesn't have fast feet, who George Groves also had, in my opinion, the physical advantages on, right? But Francisco Sierra was a slugger. He had a punch. So the one thing you didn't want to do with him was, of course, what George Groves did. Come in and try to duke it out. In other words, George Groves is Billy Conn. I could look at the guy and say, oh, look at the hand speed. Oh, look at the, foot speed. Look at the athleticism. He can win this behind a jab. Unfortunately, that's just not who he is. Even against Kenny Anderson, for some reason, George Groves decided to duke it out and got dropped in that fight. He got off the canvas. He himself got the knockout. The problem is, the one thing you cannot take away from these fighter guys, even when they have boxing ability, is that desire to mix it up, right? And the problem is, that's what a vet like Glen Johnson is looking for. He's hoping that for whatever reason, you decide to stop the lateral movement, you decide to abandon the jab and to instead throw hooks, you decide to try to take him out. Understand, Glen Johnson is a guy who knows how to hit you to the body inside, right? He's throwing combinations where he's slipping in these devastating punches to the body. We saw in the Ricky Hatton fight, Hatton's last fight, how a good body punch can just take your legs, right? George Groves, quite frankly, is not defensively blessed. His legs, in my opinion, are his defense. When he stops moving laterally and when he just stands there and tries to duke it out with you and abandons his jab, and let me just tell you, that happens in way too many fights, I believe he's vulnerable. My advice to the gamblers, sit this one out. I don't believe it's worth a bet. If you're a long shot bettor with money to throw away, literally, and you're willing to buy a lottery ticket on this fight, in other words, you don't expect to win, but you just want two long-term, long shot outcomes that might surprisingly put money in the bank if either hits, I would seriously entertain the thought of taking George Groves at plus 250 to KO Glen Johnson, and to also take Glen Johnson by plus 600 to KO George Groves. I don't see Glen Johnson winning a decision against George Groves. But what I can see is, like Billy Conn, George Groves, for whatever reason, throwing his gifts out the window, saying, hey, I have a great jab, who cares? I have great feet and can, work this fight and win this fight easily from distance, who cares? I could see George Groves throwing all of that out the window and deciding he wants to close the show, prove a point to everyone in boxing that he's the man to be the first guy to stop Glen Johnson in more than 10 years. And I could see a plausible situation where Glen Johnson then says, great, I have a young guy who's not as good as I am inside. Let's make this a fight. You don't want to give Glen Johnson that opportunity. So I would stay away from this. But if I were to bet it, if I had a gun to my head and I were just looking for lottery profits, I would swing for the fences. And I would take both guys by KO. Let me know what you think. Leave your comments for me here online. Visit us at gamblersadvisory.com and on the Roku private channel, one word, Dwyer Boxing. Thanks for watching.